Well, here we are. I suppose it's about time I did a video on a larger RPG like this. I've been a fan of open world RPGs, and especially The Elder Scrolls, for a long time. In fact, growing up, I was so exposed to the Western Bethesda and BioWare formula of RPGs that I wasn't even aware of JRPGs for a good while until my friends showed me Dragon Quest on the DS. For me, despite all of its faults and the actions of its developers, The Elder Scrolls still holds a very special place in my memory as the series that made me love RPGs. With that said, today I'll be tackling one of the most influential games in the franchise, and arguably one of the most hotly debated RPGs to ever be made. Pack your bags, because we're taking a trip up to Vardenfell to see what kind of adventure fate has in store for us in the hostile land of the Dunmer. This is Morrowind. Now, before I get into the details of this game, I should preface a few things. Firstly, I will be using two mods to run this game. I will be running the Morrowind code patch, a patch to the game that fixes a lot of bugs and stability issues and generally helps the game run smoother on modern hardware, as well as the Morrowind graphics extender mod, which allows Morrowind to use the capabilities of modern computer hardware to run extra post-processing, like better lighting, anti-aliasing, that sort of thing, to make the game look a bit better. It doesn't replace any existing models or textures, it just adds new special effects to them, as well as getting rid of the fog the game has that was used to help the game load and render things in by having them be just out of your view. I'm using these mods because personally I don't feel it's fair to judge a game like Morrowind on technical issues that are a result of the hardware and software limitations of the time. Judging a fairly niche PC title from 2002 to modern standards just isn't fair, as they simply weren't able to do a lot of what they can now at the time. So when I judge something visually about the game, I won't be talking about things like textures or models, because of course they're going to be bad. The game is almost 20 years old now. I'll be paying more attention to things like world design as a whole, that kind of thing. Speaking of which, let's get into that presentation. Personally, I think the presentation is Morrowind's strongest asset. The graphics as a whole are clearly dated, even with the extender mod, but the general design of Vardenfell truly feels like a fantasy world. Let me try to explain that. Most of the time in fantasy, you'll get races and cultures that are essentially just fantastical equivalents to some kind of modern or historical culture from our world. It doesn't truly feel different since we can clearly see what they're based on. In fact, most of the Elder Scrolls universe follows this as well. Skyrim and the Nords are fantasy Vikings. The Imperials are a British-sounding version of the Romans, and Cyrodiil is a very generic-looking European landscape. High Rock and the Bretons are based on the French and, well, the Bretons of Brittany in the west of France. The Red Guard are based on the Bedouin people, with Hammerfell being reminiscent of North Africa, while the Khajiit and elsewhere are based on Arabia, and the Argonians are the Aztecs but with swamps instead of jungles. Beyond that, the Orcs and Elves are fairly stereotypical Tolkien-esque fantasy races, with slight changes so as to not get sued. The one exception to this seems to be Morrowind and the Dunmer. The Dunmer are harder to pinpoint a single human culture or fantasy trope to, and this is reinforced by their homeland. It's kinda hard to place a human culture in an ash-covered wasteland like Morrowind since, well, most humans didn't develop in an ash-covered wasteland, so something new has to be made here. The buildings are all weirdly flat yet also curved, their armor is made out of bug chitin and bone mold, and the people are generally close-knit, preferring to keep outsiders at a distance for the sake of their own safety. You'd probably feel a similar way if you lived in a place where the local wildlife consisted of dinosaurs and large bugs that all kill and eat each other to eke out a meager existence amongst the curved trees and giant mushrooms. It's a world that feels truly fantastical and alien, which makes exploring it, at least for a little while, fairly interesting since you don't know how everything is designed the first time around. For better and for worse. And the music is definitely trying to get you into that mood as well. The main track, the now iconic one that each new Elder Scrolls game mimics, is a wonderful track for hyping somebody up to go on an adventure. But while the other songs are fitting as well, the list is definitely small, so you'll be tuning it out a lot until you notice something weird, like the majestic track of the main theme playing inside a lava cave, or you're just casually walking down the road when the combat music plays because a cliff racer spotted you and can't quite reach you. Now then, let's get on to why you end up on this island in the first place. Alright, so I won't be going too deep into the whole lore behind all of this, since that can become multiple videos in and of itself. I'll be sticking primarily to what's relevant to the main plotline. After having a strange dream, you wake up on a ship that's now docked on the island of Vardenfell in Morrowind, a province within the Cyrodiil Empire. You're told to get off the ship, where you do character creation, and are then told to go see Caius Cosades in Balmora, which also gives you your first walk to explore a little. Once there, everything very slowly starts to fall into place. Caius explains that the Emperor himself ordered that you be freed, and sent to Caius to train under him as a new member of the Blades, the Emperor's personal guard and even secret police in some ways. Regardless, before Caius is willing to let you in on what's really happening, he tells you to go explore and do some jobs and stuff to familiarize yourself with the land. And this is where you'll be directed to join one of the factions like the Fighters Guild, Thieves Guild, Mages Guild, the Imperial Legion, Imperial Cult, or if you venture out further, you can join one of the Dunmer houses, Morag Tong, etc, etc. Some are more late game than others though. For my playthrough, I decided to focus myself on combat, so I put most of my focus on the Fighters Guild and later on the Imperial Legion. I know House Redoran is an option for that too, but I just didn't get around to it. Once you've leveled a bit and got some reputation, then the real story can begin. As it turns out, the Emperor sent you here because he believes you might be the Nerevarine of ancient Dunmer prophecy. In a very basic summary, the Nerevarine is the reincarnation of the ancient Dunmer warrior Nerevar, who was supposedly killed after being betrayed by the three Dunmer who would become the Tribunal Gods, Vivec, Sothosil, and Almalexia. The prophecies claim that someone born on a certain day to uncertain parents from a place outside Morrowind would arrive and fulfill a series of prophecies that prove they're the reincarnation of Nerevar, before proceeding to slay the ancient enemy Dagoth-Ur, bring down the Tribunal for their treachery, and unite the Dunmer once again and push the outsiders from Morrowind completely. Apparently, the Emperor is convinced that you fit this prophecy for some reason, and so now it's your job to actually fulfill the rest of it and bring down Dagoth-Ur and hopefully the Tribunal as well, since, the Imperials don't really like them either. I don't really have much to say on the story, honestly. It works. I don't think it's really some masterpiece of storytelling, since ultimately it's still a Chosen One story, and it's primarily revealed to you through giant exposition dumps when the plot demands you be aware of something. What I do like, though, is how the story treats Dagoth-Ur in some ways. Dagoth-Ur is, of course, the big villain who wants to take over Morrowind and all that, but initially he actually tries to get you on his side. You run into sleeper agents who tell you that Dagoth-Ur wants to meet you at Red Mountain so you can join forces. Dagoth is reasonably upset that Nerevar, aka you, killed him, but he also recognizes that Nerevar was being manipulated by the Tribunal who also had him killed, so he tries using that to say the Tribunal are the real enemy and that you two should join forces. I mean, I don't trust him, but he makes a good point at least. But that's about all I really want to note with the story. Which means it's time to get into the spicy bit, the gameplay. Yeah, you knew this was coming, I knew this was coming. It's one of the most argued about topics regarding this game beyond the Deep Lord, so let's get in. I have very mixed feelings about the gameplay. The game plays fine, I guess, on a fundamental level, but it's still clearly dated in a lot of ways. I actually like the window system for the menus, though. I prefer having all of my information available with a single click rather than having to constantly move through sub-menus to reach my inventory, character sheet, and so on. So that's nice, especially since I can resize it to my liking. But beyond the menus, there is, of course, exploring the world. And when you explore the world, the topic of the walking speed comes up. I am firmly in the camp of thinking the walking speed is complete and utter nonsense. This is the walking speed. This is the sprinting speed. Yeah, no. Walking in Morrowind is having both your legs broken while sprinting is a brisk walk, and the only reasons I can think of for having it be this way is to either pad out game time or to make the athletic stat feel useful. If I have to metagame or calculate more efficient ways of exploring your world, then exploring your world isn't fun. It's tedious, and I'm trying to shorten the amount of time I'm doing that. It also doesn't help that fast travel is relegated purely between cities by boat, strider, or the Mages Guild. Especially when I start having to backtrack to isolated locations like the Urshilaku camp, which lack any location that I can fast travel to, which means I start to dread even starting the journey. This is why I like how modern fast travel works. You can't just start teleporting everywhere immediately, you still have to make the journey there at least once. After that, you don't need to hike across the map to turn another quest in because the game assumes your character knows the route there and simply passes the time needed for the journey for the sake of the player. If you want to compromise, the game could have done something like a Kingdom Come style system where you still get interrupted on your way there. Oh, and by the way, any immersion I might have had is completely lost by the time I've walked back and forth along the same road 20 times already, getting accosted by local wildlife when I'm backtracking to turn in another quest. It's not fun, it's tedious, and it's boring. It's also why I had to get so many hours of footage for this game, because most of it is just walking. Speaking of the local wildlife though, let's talk about the combat. Combat is the other rather contentious topic in regards to this game. Some people laud it as a beautiful merger between D&D style roll chances and action combat, while others utterly despise it for things like the roll chance ruining the immersion. For me, well, like most of this game, I've got mixed feelings. The combat feels okay, it's not some egregious insult or anything, but it really doesn't feel like there's any weight or effort in it. Morrowind was when Elder Scrolls began the transition from being a 2D Dungeons & Dragons style game to a more modern action fantasy game. And that's both a blessing and a curse. A blessing in that a lot of care is still put into world building and side questing and just overall adventuring stuff. After all, what's a good D&D campaign without side questing or exploration? But the curse comes from the fact that a lot of those same D&D style systems just don't feel right in a more action-oriented setting. Combat in Morrowind, while looking action-based, is mostly dice rolls and hit chances, armor values, the whole 9 yards. Now, plenty of games still use these systems, but those are strategy games, both real-time and turn-based. In a strategy game, you're expected to take your time, think about character stats, armor values, hit chances, the whole thing. You're planning out orders and initiatives for every character involved. You expect dice rolls and you work to maximize them to your advantage, fully knowing that you could still get screwed over by chance. But action games are different. Action games prefer putting the chance directly into the hands of the player, giving them more agency in the immediate situation. So things like dice rolls and values associated with them are mostly stripped away in favor of more direct values that the player can more easily control, meaning that results are less reliant on luck and more on raw player input and skill. Morrowind sits in this weird middle ground where it makes itself look like an action game, yet at the same time a lot of the actions that you would normally do in said action game suddenly get determined by dice rolls, which starts to get really jarring later on. Sure, things like hit chance don't begin to matter as much after you get some levels in and skill up your preferred weapon, but I maxed out my longsword skill fairly early on, and in order to earn more skill points to level up faster, I wanted to start skilling with a short sword instead, and that meant that bad dice rolls, which just prolonged basic combat, came back at level 15. It's jarring when a game presents you with what looks like a raw skill-based system where the agency is purely in your hands, only to then realize that you can still miss even though you're practically clipping inside your enemy. Now I know that was a really long-winded explanation, but I say all this because ultimately I like Morrowind. I enjoy the world, the story, the characters, the factions. I enjoy it all. I've probably recorded more footage of this game than I have for any other game I've reviewed on this channel. I mean, really, just look at the video length. It's probably longer than most videos on my channel. I like Morrowind. I'm not trying to hate on it, but there are a lot of mechanics in this game, especially in combat, that, while they're not necessarily bad, just feel really out of place here. And those are my thoughts on Morrowind. This was definitely a longer project, at least that's how it's felt for me. I like this game, I really do, but I can easily see how it turns off a lot of modern players. I can tolerate a lot of the weirdness of older games if I'm interested enough in the premise, the world, the story, or whatever. I mean, I play Arma, that alone should tell you how much I'm willing to tolerate for a game. If you think you're like me and can tolerate some jank to experience a good story and an interesting world, go right ahead and try it. If not, maybe try it, but get some mods first. This has been TheRatMan, and I will see you all later. And lastly, a special thank you shout out to my Patreon, with a $5 a month pledge is Punch McLarge Huge. Thank you for the $5.